Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of What We Love About. I'm Stephen Bauman, and in this show I'm going to be talking about an artist that needs absolutely no introduction. If you haven't heard of him, then you've been hiding under a rock somewhere for your entire artistic career. His name is Rembrandt. He is a Dutch painter active in the 1600s, and I'm going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of his techniques and some of the really special textural stuff that we find on the surface of his canvases. Primarily, I'm interested in his portraiture, though, of course, if you study his work, if you know him very well, you'll understand that he was also a fantastic landscape painter, painted genre scenes as well, and also a lot of really epic kind of giant paintings like the Night Watch. In addition, in this episode, I'm going to be inviting a colleague of mine, Ken Goshen, on, and we're going to have a kind of back and forth chat about Rembrandt, some of the things that we've learned from his work, some of the things that we appreciate, and some kind of contrasting opinions as well. So I hope that you guys really enjoy that. But without further ado, let's get to the painting so I can start some live diagramming and show you some of the things that I think are kind of most interesting and some of the things that I try to integrate into my own work. So I feel like we're in a really great place to start out here. We have this beautiful self-portrait by Rembrandt. This is what I would refer to as a kind of middle-late period. You can start to see some of the things that are really quite characteristic about his later paintings. And that is, for me at least, this overall sense of softness in the definition of the forms of the face. There's a tremendous amount of kind of color variety here. We see kind of cool temperatures juxtaposed with warm reds and warm yellows. And places where additionally you're going to find things that are almost like totally pure reds straight off the palette. This sense of kind of broken color is something that I associate with Rembrandt maturing, getting a little bit older, and probably fiddling less a little bit with his transitions and paint application. In addition, we see some tremendous simplification taking place up here in his turban. There's these massive passages where we get the sense of just a single brushstroke running all the way across the form in just the right color and value. These are really tremendous improvisations and something that I associate with later period Rembrandt. Look at the hair, for instance. We're not really talking about individual strands of hair, though it is really kind of full of detail as well. But if we kind of zoomed in, we would find almost an abstract painting filled with very direct applications of color. Yet when we zoom out and take a look at the big picture, it's actually very sound from an impressionistic perspective. We have a really kind of strong light source coming in from the upper left-hand side of the picture, hitting the form here, 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 and rolling across, really in a sense quite flawlessly towards these darker halftones, which is something that for me as a student, I remember not really grasping fully. Which is to say, I understood that there was a lot of thick paint, but I think at that time my understanding of values in the way that Rembrandt did was not very evolved. It was the combination then of very thick paint, very brisk application, and a very fine attunement to value that actually makes Rembrandt for me a little bit magical. He manages to take a very difficult medium, a very difficult material like oil paint, and make it perform well in situations that should be very difficult to control. We have here another self-portrait done in a very similar style. I would say this one probably is a little bit more refined. If we look, for instance, at the rendering of the nose, we find the features are a little bit more specifically created than we did in the previous portrait. However, there is also that sense here of what I would call broken color. Looking specifically at this area of the nose, what we can see pretty clearly is an earth red tinted with white and not fully mixed into a homogeneous color before being applied directly to the surface of the painting. This is really abstraction seeping into his fundamentally very realistic work. We can also note in other areas the very direct application of pure colors straight off of the palette unmixed in a way that I associate certainly to this period of his painting. What he understood here really was that he didn't have to mix those colors completely, that he was able to get a big picture feeling of strong, intense, vibrant color by letting our eyes kind of complete the picture for him. In a way, this is what an artist like Seurat was trying to show us with pointillism. You don't necessarily need to mix the colors. If the viewer stands back from the painting, your eyes will mix the colors visually and give you the right impression. Part of this, in my estimation, was Rembrandt trying to solve what is essentially a problem of more primitive pigments, which is to say, earth colors and pigments available to him at that time didn't tend to have the highest tinting strength. So whereas nowadays we have cad yellows, cad reds, we have phthalo blues and greens. We can push color and temperature to unheard of places. Those things were not available to Rembrandt, so he needed to maximize what he was able to do with his limited palette. Which, let's just say, of course, by limited I mean probably he had blues. He had in one sense a full range of color available to him, but in relationship to what we use nowadays, it would seem very limited indeed. So this is a Rembrandt from a little bit earlier, and I've brought it here really to kind of show what I was talking about in terms of broken color versus fully homogeneous and refined colors. Here we can see pretty clearly that the colors are thoroughly blended into each other. There's no more pure right off the palette reds in the shadows. There's no pure right off the palette yellows. All of the colors are thoroughly mixed and blended. And even though we have a tremendous amount of variation between reds, yellows, grays for cool temperatures, intense peachy oranges, we're not going to mistake any of them for looking how the colors do in this painting. Of course, I'll leave it up to you to decide which one of those you prefer, but this is what I mean when I'm talking about the different periods or phases of Rembrandt's career. There's things to appreciate in each of them, and as artists ourselves, I think that's what we take away when we visit museums. We take away the things that we love, and we want to apply to our own work. Finally, we come to another Rembrandt that, for me, represents the early period of his career really well. It's one of my favorites from that era. The color intensity is amazing. The refinement of the features is beautiful. The technique is flawless, except for those particular kinds of flaws that we love to find that show us that Rembrandt is a little bit human also. So let's take a look at the color and see what we find in this one. The intense rosy peach of the cheeks here is juxtaposed against this really cool gray-green in the dark halftones. Some of the coloration in this one will come down to varnish aging over time, but still that arrangement of warm and cool temperature would be very primary in his understanding of the application of color to flesh tones. The nose in particular is one of my absolute favorites. Look at the turning forms that run along this top edge. So soft and so refined, yet we don't lose really any sense of structure inside of that. In addition, the range of application in the eyes, the specificity of the downward facing plane of the upper eyelid, the little flecks of vermilion that sit just at the top edge of the lower eyelid, that unmistakable sense of glassiness that we get from the highlight on the eye that's on the more shaded side of the head. Classic Rembrandt, really beautiful. In addition, don't miss the softness in the edges of the lights that he's painting. There's no crude or kind of hard edges running through here. In some ways, when I'm looking this closely at it, I just get the sense that this is a kind of more micro-modeled version of the same thing that he was doing later on in his paintings, but maybe just with a little bit more economy in the way that he was doing it. So that brings to a close the paintings from Rembrandt that I wanted to show you today. And now that you have those textures and those images kind of locked into your eyes, let's switch over to the conversation that I had with Ken Goshen about Rembrandt and the things that we appreciate in his work.
I took a moment to reflect on these areas of Rembrandt paintings where he graces us with like a bit of insight into his process, where you see the unfinished moments of his paintings. And to me, they always feel so loose. They just feel unbelievably, like impossibly loose, because he would have these like corners of paintings where you can see maybe the drawing showing through, or an area of the painting that's barely rendered, that's just like a little bit of a wash on top of basically nothing.
Yeah. And
to me, it just screams how loose he was, and how probably fast he was getting the painting to like the 80% mark. And then, the rest of the way you could see evidence of like glazing and scumbling and more sophisticated stuff. But a lot of the big construction just looks like, at least to me, like chunky, alla prima, fearless.
Yeah, what you see is what you get, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
What's there on the surface is that's what's happening, yeah. Nothing more, nothing less. Yeah, it's the exciting part of Rembrandt, I feel like, is that, because as old of a painter as he is, I mean, we're talking like the 1600s, his paintings are so like fresh and they have so much punch. I mean, there's painters nowadays that I think want to work like Rembrandt that seem a little bit overwrought, and he was able to keep it that fresh, keep it that exciting. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. No, actually, I kind of interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, just to finish that thought. And so for me, I was kind of daring myself whether or not I could just kind of, jump in, no drawing, no nothing, and just kind of see if into that whole painterly mess I could end up making sense of it. And not to say that I'm, impressed with my own result or anything, but I kind of felt like I understood maybe 1% more of what Rembrandt was doing, because usually when I want to draw anything or paint anything, I would instinctively say, okay, let me just get a good drawing in there, let me just kind of put some safety net underneath it. But I feel like there's something that's so true to the way that Rembrandt is painting that it's like walking the tightrope, and it's like underneath there's just an abyss. And I feel like living with that fear kind of inserts a degree of drama that I find it difficult to fake. You know, when I'm too comfortable painting, and I've copied Rembrandt, I can't even count the number of times, but I don't feel like I managed to insert that sense of drama and a little bit of the fear that I just captured in this tiny little sketch, and so I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, his work, you know, when you look really closely into his paintings, his work is like this, and we're talking, of course, about like, I think, late mid Rembrandt. You know, there's that kind of early Rembrandt where it is very tight, it's very resolved. There's that late period Rembrandt where it's disintegrating into something totally different, not in a bad way, but just different. And there's that kind of mid period where there was still so much form, there was still so much delicacy in the rendering, but it was so like rough. The way that you see one flick of a brush left just as it is in like this central focal area, and you feel like it shows that he is, for me at least, in my opinion, one of the biggest picture kind of painters. I feel like he never lost a focus on the biggest version of the picture. He was all the way zoomed out. He was looking from across the room, conceptually, as we do at a picture, and he understood that rendering was not a uniform equation, that it was something that, depending upon like the kind of impression you wanted to create, you know, the way that you rendered, you know, contributed to that, and almost in, and this sounds crazy, but almost in like a postmodern way. You know, Rembrandt's paintings are also about paint in a way that we associate like modern painters to, you know, like you look at David Hockney's, in my opinion, not great paintings of like swimming pools in California, where the paint is like splashed on to show the splash of the water. You know, it's this very, very postmodern like appreciation or use of paint as a material that's narrative. But you see that in Rembrandt, and by the way, in a very much more sophisticated way. You see that in his work, and it's so interesting with modern eyes to kind of look at him like that. I don't know, I talked a little bit about the different phases of like Rembrandt appreciation. Where is the Rembrandt that you most appreciate? Like where in the timeline?
Easy. Latest works. And I find that to be the case for me almost always with artists. I just tend to really love the later works. I like when everything's disintegrating into nothing, because to me what it communicates basically is you kind of let go of the necessity that young people have to impress. When you're young, you just want people to love you. You just want to be like, I'm going to make that painting that everybody's going to be writing articles about. And then when you're old, you kind of don't care anymore. And at least that's my, I mean, I don't know. I haven't been old yet, but I hope that this part of me that demands attention and all this kind of stuff fades away when you're older, and, you know, you look back at your life and you're just picking up a brush and you say, I'm just going to put the bare essentials, you know? And to me, it's something like a distillation process. Like things just kind of fall away over the years, and then what you're left with is just the raw core. And to me, that's so emotionally effective. And so I don't like when I'm seeing people trying to impress me, because as a contrarian, I kind of want to not be impressed. I'm just like, all right, I get it, but then it just rubs me the wrong way. And this can be said, I think that the greatest two examples of this are Rembrandt and Titian. With both of them, you can really see the early work is very like refined and soft, and look, I can make people look like they're made of crystal and all that stuff. I mean, I appreciate it and I love it, but I also find that there's some part of it that really, again, is like trying to assert their self-worth in a way that, to me, emotionally, it just feels a little tedious. And then as they mature, it just becomes, and it's amazing when you think about it. And I know this is a Rembrandt conversation, but in the Titian context, when people were saying, oh, you know, his older works, like he could barely see, like you could read what people were saying about him. They were just, forgive the great Titian for becoming a worse painter. Like that's what they were saying about him at the time. And for me, it's such nonsense. You could see that as he was maturing, he just really understood what mattered about painting, and he just filled up the work with that. And if it means that we, quote unquote, lose some of the rendering, I feel like we gain more than we lose. And before I throw it back to you, I just wanted to say, because you were talking about the whole picture thing,
Sure.
there are self-portraits where you can see him and the easel, and he's standing really far away from the easel when he's looking into the mirror, in a kind of distance that, I'm looking at my tiny space, and I'm like, man, I got to get more space. Like Rembrandt was standing really, really far from the painting. And it's honestly something that I really recommend to students when you're judging your work. Like, take a few steps back, try to look at the whole thing. Otherwise, you're going to be confined to looking at it like just through individual moments of the painting. Like, is the ear working? Is the shoulder working? But then does it all really come together? And I think you hit the nail on the head there, that Rembrandt is one of the more sensitive painters to how the whole picture works as a whole. And I honestly think stepping back is not an insignificant part of it.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right there too, to kind of pick up on that too, because it is also that physical sense of literally stepping back. Getting that physical distance also can help in some ways, I think, with like an emotional distance. You kind of get that, you get into a painting so much sometimes, you kind of forget everything else. You're just zeroing in on this one thing, and that is the enemy, frankly, of the big picture. For those of you out there, by the way, watching that like Ken and myself, I have a studio at home too, who don't have like all the space in the world, a handheld mirror, a small handheld mirror is a really great way to kind of get that big picture stepping back vibe without actually having 6-7 meters to kind of walk across the room and look at. I've even seen people using like reducing lenses and stuff. I've never tried one, but it's the same idea, that actually getting a physical distance, or the perspective that you gain from that, can really help you to understand how the big picture in your painting really works. It's a difficult thing to assess. Of course, we have to say with Rembrandt, even his early work, as meticulous as it is, of course, doesn't lack that sense of big picture either.
It doesn't. And I totally want to piggyback on your recommendation to have a handheld mirror. I find that even if you could use a black mirror, that really helps as well. To the people who don't know what a black mirror is, it's basically like a piece of glass with like some dark color painted on the back, so that what it does is it doesn't show you the image perfectly, but it shows you the image in a very compressed way. Like, you see the values tend to kind of distinguish themselves best at like what's dark, what's light. It helps you really look at the big picture. And conveniently enough, there's an app that's really easy to download onto a smartphone to get a black mirror. It's called
I was just gonna say, isn't it like turning your phone off?
So when I'm in my studio, I would use the app of the closed phone and just look at it literally through that. And for me, it's very effective. So I highly recommend it. It's honestly my favorite app. Just keep the phone closed, and it's very helpful. And I love how you were saying psychological distance, an exercise that I really recommend for trying to understand what's wrong with your work. Because honestly, pushing a painting forward, to me, if we think about it in a very simple way, it's identifying what's wrong, then fixing it. What area needs my attention right now, and then fixing it. And sometimes we find it difficult to look at our own work and assess which areas are currently like not working as well as they could. And I find that a really helpful construction is to actually imagine that your worst enemy painted the painting. And now you are in class and you have the opportunity to finally critique that person and tell them all the numerous ways in which that painting currently is failing. And then you're like, it's this painting's whatever, Bob painted it. And Bob, you got the shoulder wrong and the nose wrong and the this wrong, and here the color's too saturated. You have like an ongoing list of things that you would tell Bob. Then just flip back and you're like, oh, it's mine. Oh, well, I guess I got to go fix them now.
For sure. There's like a lot of different ways. And I think this is a really powerful one, like to kind of, because what we're talking about is getting that emotional distance. It is notoriously challenging. I mean, we put so much of our heart and soul into our work, and when it's not working, that's quite difficult to confront. So these exercises, these mental exercises that give you that emotional distance, I think are really helpful, because eventually, and we're digressing very far afield, actually, I'm going to cut the digression here, because I do want to return to Rembrandt for a moment and kind of twist this lens around a little bit, because something that I find when I'm doing a master copy, right, is I'm actually searching certainly for the things that I appreciate, right, like the things that I love. As a student, I can recall not really turning that eye on my own paintings, right, not assessing them from the perspective of, what is happening here that I actually appreciate, that I can accentuate, that I can kind of lean into. And if anything, like looking at Rembrandt, it's a way, and studying him closely, making master studies of his work, is a way to kind of take the things that you love there and really kind of try to transplant them into your work. I think as artists, as practitioners, this is a lot of how we go to museums, right? It's fact finding. It's searching out these like strange little moments, and which, by the way, is Rembrandt's work fraught with anything more than strange little moments. Just in the one self-portrait that we were working on today, you could go just inch by inch, in a grid across that painting and find little worlds inside of each one of them. I'm sure that like in his work, this was not something like kind of taken for granted. I am filibustering, but I want to say one more thing about that as well, just with regard to what we were talking about in terms of kind of getting over that need to be meticulous, right? Because Rembrandt clearly kind of goes through these phases. I myself, I think I'm a little bit older than you, no?
Yeah, are you 40?
40, yeah.
I'm 32.
Okay, all right. So a little bit older. I can definitely recognize in myself that need certainly to render things out, and I love and I appreciate kind of working that way. But I have found consistently as I do get a little bit older that it's not that time is more precious or there's something about my eventual non-existence that is impending that kind of makes me think about this, but I just don't have as much time to fuss about these things. And when I look at Rembrandt, I very much get that feeling that he's not consciously saying, now I want to paint about paint, but he just understands I don't need to waste my time on these going across the river to get a drink of water here. I'm going to take it as it is, and that's that kind of joy of immediacy that I find in his work.
I love that so much. I feel like it takes somebody of your advanced age, Stephen, to share that insight with me, because I never honestly thought about how simply true that is. When you think that your days on this planet are running short, you don't have time for nonsense. That is so much wisdom. I'm gonna take a few moments to soak that in. I just love it. But yeah, I totally agree with you, and it just strikes me that really produces something that is far truer to what I think a painting needs to be. In a painting, you need to kind of say, I'm going to put in there what matters most, and I'm not going to waste your time as the viewer with trying to, the way that I phrase it, trying to make the painter like look all glorious. It's more of like almost like a giving spirit. It's like, here, that's what you're after, take it. Like, that's what I'm going to put out there for you, and I'm not going to really worry about how that makes me look, So I want to throw that question back at you. So are you on the same boat, that you like the later paintings a little bit more than the earlier ones?
It's hard. It's notoriously hard with Rembrandt, because if you do take that mindset of just, what do I like, you could just fill a book on each kind of period going, I love this, I love this, I love this. I think the Rembrandt that made me really subscribe to the Rembrandt way of seeing things is the later kind of mid period, where he is, I think, communicating something slightly different. And I wouldn't prescribe to others to say I feel like it's better or worse. Like I feel like descriptors like that for me don't really apply so much as what moves me, what I appreciated about it. I view the later mid stuff as actually, in fact, a lot more complex in terms of the different levels that it hits. Because there are parts that you look at that do have that sense of like refinement and rendering, and there's other parts that just get blown out completely, and you can isolate just giant individual brush strokes in them, or a very underrated thing about Rembrandt, let's just side note talk about his background. He is one of the greatest painters of backgrounds that there is. We of course we get so consumed in looking at the faces in his portraits, and his backgrounds change throughout the years as well. But consider that you're never going to be so convinced of a portrait unless the background doesn't distract you from it. But at the same time, and this is what amazes me, they never fail to be complex and full of variety. So they're complex, they're full of variety, yet they never rob you. They never rob you of the moment, the chance to appreciate like the center of kind of focal interest. Do you know what I'm saying?
I totally know what you're saying. It's actually one of the more difficult things to get right when you're just starting out. I mean, at least in my experience, when I see people in their, first 3 years even of an atelier program, they usually it's far easier for them to get to the point where they can paint a torso in a very impressive way. But to not make a background boring is notoriously hard. And I remember sitting in the school where I was studying across like from another, students, and we're just talking like, how do we solve this problem? Like, how do we solve the problem of making a background interesting, and yet, as you explain it, not have it become the center of attention? Because there's a kind of correlation. As soon as you convince yourself that you're interested in something, then it becomes very, very interesting, and it starts grabbing a lot of attention. And I think this brings me back to the music analogy. I happen to be a bass player, and that's kind of what bass playing is. You got to do your job, but not attract the attention. Like, that when you don't play the bass right, the whole song falls apart. But it's not your place to overplay the bass such that, everybody's completely overwhelmed by the lower frequency. So to me, painting a background right, you got to think, what would I do if I was a bass player? Okay, I would do exactly what's necessary so that this composition flows, but no more than that. And
Yeah.
So yeah, everybody who wants to get better at painting backgrounds should pick up a bass. It's my tip.
I love that. I love that. That's a perfect, and I like that it went to a rock and roll place instead of like a symphonic music place, right? So I think it's like a metaphor. Certainly I've caught myself using. It's like all things playing in concert, like a symphony. But you could just say the same about a rock and roll band, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, my musical analogies are gonna be rock and roll because that's the music that I listen to and that's the music that I play. But for sure, the double bass and the orchestra, the tuba, you might say. For those of you orchestral fans, the background's the tuba, people. So that works as well. But I also wanted to not lose something that you were saying. You were saying that we go to museums to pick stuff that we can later incorporate into our own practice. What would you say are some of the things that you tried to take or have taken from Rembrandt into your own personal practice? And if there are things that you're still trying to incorporate but haven't done so yet?
In terms of going to museums, actual empirical things that I feel like I would have taken from Rembrandt, one of them that I found really interesting was the way that he uses broken color, right? Which is to say, when we think about like fully mixed colors, like we take red and we tint it with white, and then we take a bit of yellow ochre and we put into that. With our palette knives, we mix it into this totally homogeneous color. That is going to create one kind of color effect. When you go up to some Rembrandt self-portraits of a particular period, what you're going to find is places where, for instance, like a terra rossa, like an earth red and a white, are mixed together and applied without actually becoming fully homogeneous. Now, it looks to our eyes, if we're looking at this as students, we think, oh, like he's not fully mixing. It kind of doesn't look right. But in fact, he's just creating a different kind of color impression. And so what that expanded for me was the idea of, in a way, like how color can operate on a canvas, right? And I know that sounds like deeply technical, but we all know the difference in between taking one color and washing it transparently and then like putting it on with a palette knife opaquely. It looks so different, right? There's such a great variety in the way that same paint will express itself. Well, imagine now if you took those same admixtures but actually didn't totally mix them till they were homogeneous, left them broken, it would create a different kind of effect. So for me, it just revealed that as a possibility, like a tool in your kit that you could have. The other thing that I think I really take away from Rembrandt a lot, and I just mentioned it, was actually kind of taking the time to study and look at his backgrounds. The things that you find are certainly a contrast in between transparency and opacity. With a background, you're kind of limited in terms of, I think, the themes that you can play on. One of them you can play on is depth. Another one is the way light passes through a background. And when we think of things being light, as painters, of course, we think about reflective white pigments that are opaque. And when you think about shadow, you think about transparency and depth. It's just the nature of the material that kind of speaks to that. And you see how he uses those qualities to create a really enriched sense of depth around the model. So those are like two things that for me really kind of, I could just put a pin on them and say, that's where I found that. You know what I mean? What about you? You go to the museum, you're looking at Rembrandt. What are you like, what are you capturing?
I think you hit on something that is very, very big for me, which is this this treatment of opacity. I feel like Rembrandt has brought this to a level of mastery that we have not seen since, really. And to me, what it speaks of is actually the fact that opacity is not a dichotomy. And because I used to think opaque, transparent, like basically, or light, very opaque, shadow, very transparent, and also like the opaque agent, white, transparent pigments, earth colors and the rest. But actually in Rembrandt, the more that I study his work and the more that I do copies, I understand that sometimes he goes as far as to, for example, use ochre as an opaque agent. Like sometimes you would look at a background specifically. In the background, you see that with Rembrandt, and you also see that with Velasquez, and you say, okay, that's the opaque area of the background. And then you mix that color and you put a little bit of white in it, and you're like, okay, I mean, I know how to do that. That's the opaque area. So I put some white, and that goes too opaque. It just goes too opaque, even if you use lead white, which I do, which is supposed to grant me a little bit more leeway in the transparency. And then I would say, well, shoot. I mean, I already made it too opaque. And then I realized, like, oh my goodness, like I could arrive at this kind of opaque looking mixture just by mixing like raw umber and ochre. The way that raw umber sinks into the canvas, it gives it like a matte effect, the thing that painters always like shy away from and think, oh no, like I got that sinking feeling of that opaque madness. Well, that we don't love in our shadows, but actually using that to mix some of the opaque areas in the background, like just some ochre and umber, I was shocked by how opaque I could make a color feel without using white. So basically something that he does with the distribution of opaque and transparent pigments, I feel like is absolutely symphonic and sublime. Like he uses the pigments that need to be there, and his knowledge of the way that different colored pigments behave is so intimate. And I think it's very difficult to get to this place today because we just, we're very detached from the pigment powders. We go to the art shop and we buy the tubes and we're like, whatever, this is brown, da da da. But for him, this is not brown. Like this, when you grind your own burnt sienna and you grind your own ochre, you are very intimately familiar with the fact that these are not the same materials. They might eventually both translate into different sets of oil paint, but their chemical composition is completely different and they have different properties. And he went to town with that diversity of pigment application. And I feel like that's something that I continuously get blown away by and try to incorporate into my work. Like, for sure, I love this pigment nerdery and I learn every time I would look at a Rembrandt and I'm at a point where I can see the colors that he mixed, and Mansell wise, I can nail it. Like I understand this and such value, this and such chroma, this and such hue, but then you mix that quote perfect close quote color onto your canvas, and you're like, feels wrong, man. I used the wrong pigments, and it matters in a Rembrandt. It matters, and I love that it matters, and I want it to matter in my work as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating you mentioned that too. As soon as you started talking about this topic, I thought of like his intimacy, his familiarity with the materials that he would have used. And another kind of cool perspective on it, and I think you touched on it, I just want to kind of divert into that direction, was the problem he was trying to solve. Like we think of Rembrandt, of course, as being very creative in terms of like how he used paint to manifest the impression he was creating. Think about for a moment that really he had to. With the pigments that we have available to us today, you even mentioned just titanium white versus lead white. We've really pushed the envelope now in terms of like what's possible chroma wise, what's possible value and opacity wise. We have all sorts of materials that available to us that he definitely didn't. So you think about materials available, in the kind of early-ish 1600s. And you think, well, how do you maximize those? well, you really have to get creative in terms of like how different layers interact with each other. Like how you're doing something really subtle, like using an ochre to make something opaque instead of a white, so that where you are using white really stands out, right? And it's what it is, in my opinion, looking at it, is it's a creativity that comes out of a tremendous limitation, right? That he would have had only so many pigments to work with, right? These are antique pigments. And he was somebody who was very concerned with maximizing the effect and the impact that you can get out of those. You know, he probably didn't have, certainly didn't have, cadmium lemon yellow. He's not getting that, right? So how do you get to that place without it? It's got to be about layering and creativity and using the ground, the light in the ground to come through. And anyway, a lot of different creative solutions. Interesting.
Yeah,
that,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. And you're elevating the subject and hitting exactly on another note that I feel like I want to learn from Rembrandt. Really, for me, whatever it is I put on the palette, and I'm no stranger to the contemporary pigments. Like I have deep affection for cadmium lemon. I love that pigment. But whatever it is I put on my palette, I want to make sure I stretch it to the limit. Like if I put cadmium lemon on the palette, man, that stuff, this is like I don't know. You want to, how to explain it? Really, I'm like baffled for analogies, because it's so fundamentally emotional for me. Like you don't put something out there just because you have it in your box. And so for me, there's really this degree of magic. Like what is magic really? Where is that sense of effortlessness coming from? I feel like it comes from taking limited means and expanding them. And you can say that about a 20 pigment palette, because even a 20 pigment palette pales in comparison to what we see in life, right? So if I'm in the landscape, I'd be very sad if you don't give me a green. I mean, I'd be very, very sad if you don't give me some cerulean blue. But whatever it is, even when I put 10 pigments, 15 pigments on my palette, I want to make sure that the end result looks like I've expressed the maximum amount of visual effects from these pigments. And if I'm not planning on doing it, then give me the few pigments, and I'll do better. And also an example that I always use with students, when they talk about the limitations of medium, it's like, oh, graphite can't do this, oh, charcoal can't do that. I always use the same analogy, and I think, imagine if you just gave Rembrandt coffee and a napkin. You think he couldn't capture this portrait? Like, Rembrandt is the ultimate person that you gave him the most muddy, insignificant, like insufficient medium, but just have his eyes for looking at the world. And even coffee in a napkin could produce a masterpiece. I'm absolutely convinced at that.
Definitely in Rembrandt's hands, for sure. Ken, let's go ahead and leave it there. I had a great time chatting with you today. And where can we find what you're getting up to? Where can we find you?
So we can find me at kengoshen.com for my website that kind of has the majority of my stuff. You can find me at Ken Goshen on Instagram. And to support my work, you can go to patreon.com/Ken Goshen. And Steven, I had a great time doing this. Educational, fun, rock and roll, symphonies. We nailed all the bases, I think. It's really fun.
It was a rock and roll symphony, for sure.
Awesome.
Thanks, Ken.
Until next time, take care, man.
So that was our show for today. Thank you so much for watching this episode of What We Love About. And if you enjoy the content on this channel, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps me to kind of grow my subscriber base. I also want to say, if you're interested in in-depth portraiture tutorials in either graphite, oil paint, or charcoal, there is a link that should pop up somewhere around here that will take you directly to my Patreon page, where you can subscribe for $5 or $10 and find tons of tutorial content. There's also model packs, and usually every month I have some kind of special offer going on, so please check out that link. Once again, I'm Steven Bauman. Thank you so much for watching.